The Quran includes many stories that can be found in other texts that existed at the time when it was created. So not only did the Quran use the Bible as a source, it also used Jewish commentaries, Christian apocryphal literature, and even sources that contain stories about pagan heroes. In other words, the Quran was very much a product of its time. Let me put it this way. If a person were to go back in a time machine to the Middle East in the year 600 CE and randomly collect a bunch of stories that were popular at the time, that collection would likely look very similar to the contents of the Quran. Of course, the Quran also includes commentary on those stories and theological lessons, so even if one doesn't see the Quran as being a word-for-word miracle sent from God, one can still see it as containing valuable insight. Now, of course, one could argue that the reason why the Quran contains many stories that can be found in other literature of the time is that the Quran is in fact an accurate account of events, authored by the creator of the universe. Taken on faith, this is indeed a valid position. However, taken strictly on the principles of the historical method, it is not. Well, let's look at several examples. The first is a story about Abraham. In the Quran, in Surah 21, Abraham smashes his father's idols during his youth in Babylon, and then is thrown into a fire by the king as a punishment. But God saves him, and he survives unharmed. Now, although this story is not found in the Bible, it is in fact found in a text that predates the Quran. It comes from a commentary on the book of Genesis written by a rabbi sometime between 300 and 500 CE. So it's certainly possible that Muhammad was familiar with the story. Another example is a story about Mary, the mother of Jesus. In the Quran, in Surah 19, Mary comes across a palm tree while she is pregnant. In order to feed his mother, Jesus performs a miracle from within the womb, causing figs to fall from the tree when shaken. Again, this story is not found in any of the 4 canonical Gospels. However, as I mentioned in my episode about the Gospels, there were actually many other Gospels, ones that did not make it into the New Testament. One of these is known as Pseudo-Matthew. In Pseudo-Matthew, a very similar story is told about Mary and the palm tree. The only difference is that in Pseudo-Matthew, the palm tree actually bends its branches so that Mary can reach the figs. Now, Pseudo-Matthew was written around the same time as Muhammad lived, but in a very different location. So I think it's unlikely that Muhammad got the story directly from Pseudo-Matthew, or that Pseudo-Matthew got it directly from Muhammad. What's more likely is that this was simply a well-known story that was floating around at the time, and that both authors were familiar with it. My third example is the story of the sleepers in the cave. In the Quran, in Surah 18, it tells a story about some men who were being persecuted for their beliefs. They take refuge in a cave, where God causes them to go into a deep sleep, one that miraculously lasts over 300 years. They therefore end up escaping the persecution. This story is actually a well-known Christian legend that appears in multiple sources predating the Quran. The earliest one being that of the Syrian poet Jacob of Sirah. One more example. Later in the same surah, Surah 18, the Quran mentions a man called Dhul Qarnayn, a phrase that literally means the two-horned one. According to the Quran, Dhul Qarnayn travels to the east, to a mountainous region where a group of people are being persecuted by 2 evil nations, known as Gog and Magog. He helps them by building a giant wall to keep Gog and Magog at bay. This story is very similar to a well-known legend about Alexander the Great that was very common in ancient times. In fact, Alexander the Great was often depicted as having horns, hence the name Dhul Qarnayn, the two-horned one.